and welcome to another episode of our show 28.4 FM, connecting India's youth to the world through discourse. In our series on dissent, we're going to be talking about online expression today. And this is important to all of us because all of us have two presences today, one in the offline world and one on the virtual and online space. And often what we do online has consequences offline. In fact, India has the second highest number of internet users in the world today, with nearly 40% of us online at some point or the other. So it is no surprise that this medium has come under heavy government regulation in the recent past. As I mentioned, online interactions have offline repercussions, especially in fractious democracies such as India. But to what extent does this justify restrictions on speech online by the government? To discuss this and the nuances of this extremely complex issue, we have with us one of the leading voices for a free and open internet in India, Apar Gupta, who is a trained lawyer and executive director of the Internet Freedom Foundation, an advocacy group that fights for a free and open internet that is consistent with the constitutional liberties guaranteed to Indian citizens, is on the show today with us. Apar, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited and looking forward to engaging with you, and also look forward to feedback from the listeners and the viewers of this podcast.
Awesome. So I want to start off with a very high level question. In your view, what is the state of internet freedom in today's India? How does it sort of compare with the rest of the world? And why is this, of all issues, so important to you and your organization?
So the first thing is that as dark, gloomy things may seem, and I know that the crying emoji should be the emoji for this year, we should not forget that 600 million active internet connections are there in India. It's at its very core, empowering force, which people in our day-to-day lives have not had before. So when we look at people who help us, who come from different socioeconomic strata, who basically enable our lives, who have essentially not had the facilities towards, firstly, receiving knowledge, and secondly, being participants in democracy, I think the internet is providing them a very important transformational technology they've not had ever. Now, the issue is, how do we even overcome the next barriers of the digital divide and make sure that there is what we like to call at IFF 4G for all? Just like electricity, food have been recognized to be core governance priorities for people. The second element I would like to touch upon is what people who already have access quite often think about, is their sense of liberty online and how mediated that is. And what I mean by mediated is that it's always a negotiation. We're almost self-censoring ourselves every now and then. And we're almost feeling that there are some threats lurking and my data can be leaked. Somebody is snooping on me, or what happens if I say this and I get into a fight, or do I say something which is just too political? For instance, any of my viewpoints may seem to be against the government, against the country, or against my friends, and what will be the reaction to it? So it's a tremendous amount of flux, if that's the adjective I can label that. So the internet is now in flux, but it is both a threat as well as an opportunity, especially in the year of COVID, given that social distancing, as well as remote learning, as well as gaining medical health information, or just being in touch with our friends and family, has become essentially a digitally facilitated interaction.
That's absolutely correct. And something that IFF indulges in, and something that is of interest to me, is digital transparency through the Right to Information Act. And this is something that I'm interested in, and I would like to ask you straight up, is IFF is consistent with the use of Right to Information Act to bring transparency and accountability from the government. But the recent amendment, that is, of course, the 2019 amendment, has brought structural changes, if I may say so.
Yeah.
How will this affect the advocacy or the campaigns that IFF is indulging itself in? what are the
Yeah.
consequences?
So Sanskriti, some core metrics. I asked my staffer Anushka, who heads this vertical, on what we like to call is digital transparency, and we filed 324 applications this year. And we got responses to a lot of them. A lot of them were returned. What's important for people to understand here, the RTI Act is a central enactment. So just a short civics lesson here. Okay, when I say central enactment, essentially Parliament has made it, and it applies to uh, all the government ministries which are there at the center. Okay, so the Ministry of Food or the Ministry of Electronics and IT, it doesn't apply to, for instance, your state government. So if you're in a city and can you file a RTI request against the police department, or the municipal department, asking when was this road constructed, why is this barricade there? That is under the State RTI Act. And if you want to read more about the RTI Act, there's a great book by the NCPRI and the MKSS collective, which is called the RTI Story. So the way I think about history, about any kind of progressive legislation, is they're front and backs. And what you realize by reading that book is that there was close to 2 decades of struggle through which the RTI Act emerged with its learnings. And it was almost an accident. I've done a book review about it as well in the Indian Express. So what we need to always keep in mind is the longer arc of history. We may go forward, we may go back, but we should not essentially give up. We should have this vision of a positive future. Much more immediately, you're right that the amendments which have been caused, the systemic understaffing, under-resourcing of the CIC has led to a large amount of pendency. So the CIC is the Central Information Commission. It hears appeals when you don't get information, and that's what's happened in a large category of the 324 RTI applications we filed. A lot of times the officers have said, hey, we don't have that information. So you can go directly to the CIC as a complaint, or you can also prefer appeal with the first information officers. So it's a 3-step process. And what we've quite often turned up with is nothing, but quite often we've also turned up with really valuable information. The second element is also that the RTI Act by itself is an activated act which relies on citizen participation. It doesn't only rely on activists, and this has been the experience all through. So as people become much more connected with technology, as e-governance services become much more connected with technology, it's much more important for us to understand how are those technologies being devised, how are the legal impacts resulting on us. There's quite often these technologies with legal impacts. For instance, on people's rations, does my thumbprint match in a biometric authentication? Do my iris scans match in a biometric authentication? Will be determined by an algorithm at the back end with a accuracy score. Now, all of these things are operating on a technical level which may emerge or may not emerge from law. And quite often they're not emerging from law. That's why people need to question. People need to file RTI applications. And that's why we made it a core element of our work. That RTI, the RTI is a core element, in fact, of the larger civil society, social sector work, because it instills a larger amount of transparency in decision making, use of public funds, brings accountability to government processes. And I think it's a core framework for participative, messy, fractured democracy that is India. We are nowhere perfect. Democracy is never perfect. Democracy is noisy. Democracy is fractious. It's built of compromises. And the RTI Act, in fact, makes sure that we have good information, both from the government side as well as at the private side, in ensuring that the public policy outcomes which are devised much more credible and evidence-based. So I think it's also in the benefit of government to, in fact, put out more information. Because the RTI Act not only is an applicant-driven process, it also has provisions within it that the government needs to proactively publish information on the basis of which it takes decisions. So I think a conceptual understanding of the RTI Act, which links to our constitutional freedoms, is what emerges slowly. And it is very important in the realm of technology.
Speaking of constitutional freedoms, I want to touch upon what this means for our digital interactions and expression online. So just to set the standard and help our listeners understand, what rights do a citizen have in terms of their online interactions? What should they be aware of? And if they are violated, what is their possible recourse?
So, a quick civics lesson again. Part 3 of the Constitution contains what are called as fundamental rights, and the right which is most immediately attracted in terms of access to the internet are two rights which were listed by the Supreme Court in a January judgment called Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India that concerns the telecommunication shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir, which was subsequent to the political reorganization and the revocation of its special status. Now, that led also to, firstly, immediately with respect to a complete telecommunications ban, but a continuing ban on 4G based internet access, which is the predominant way of how ordinary Indians access the internet. And that is, in fact, exceeding 500 days. However, the judgment did lay down an important recognition that that the right to access the internet in fact links to Article 19(1)(a), which is the freedom of speech and expression, and secondly, Article 19(1)(g), which is linking to the right to carry on trade and business. These may be restricted under grounds of legislation. Again, no right is absolute, but there needs to be a reasonable restriction, reasonable being assessed by the judiciary, whether it's proportional, it's necessary, and the restriction needs to be grounded in law through, again, a law made by Parliament or state legislature. This law needs to link to what are the listed grounds of legislation, and these grounds of legislation include public order, morality, defamation, friendly relations with other countries, the sovereignty and integrity of India. So what has happened essentially is that the right to internet access per se is not a fundamental right, textually there in the Constitution. However, it links to other fundamental rights. So this recognition is there. That's the first thing. Okay. So the government's power to shut down the internet now comes with certain safeguards. The second is also blocking of websites, which is a form of censorship. But much more recently, what's happening on social media, as a commentator has described it, is information floods, where on social networks where most of our chatter and conversation takes place, there is almost a flood of information, which makes us confused. We can't gather a good sense about what's happening. And this kind of flood also makes it very hard for people to organize what are called as digital assembly or digital protests. And this has been demonstrated very well and written about by Zainab Tufekci in a book which is called Twitter and Tear Gas. This is the first order of censorship itself, which is, firstly, a person does not have access, which is a form of censorship in a positive understanding of our constitutional rights. The second is the deprivation of access, which happens through an internet shutdown or through a blocking of website or filtering of certain types of websites, which we have not seen the latter category in India. But much more immediately, what's also happening is information floods, misinformation and disinformation. So censorship is a growing problem, both from the state end, but also much more recently with respect to the control which is exercised by private platforms, which are large Silicon Valley companies, which quite often take arbitrary standards. They enforce it in a way which makes us question their decisions. And we say, why is A censored? Why is B not censored? It's a tremendously complex area. And it depends on who is essentially censoring whom under what conditions. So the recourse and remedy, which is the final part of your question, quite often depends on who is doing what. And also these remedies are imperfect. For instance, if the government shuts down the internet, my work is continuing as part of larger teams which are litigating around it. Internet shutdowns is an area where reforms are needed. Website blocking remains a process which is opaque, which is secret, in which orders actually are not released while websites are blocked. And India is slipping down the index of democracies in terms of its rankings, which are done by what is called Freedom of on the Net, which is a yearly ranking. So I would say that the internet is not divorced from our day-to-day politics. It's very close to it. And what we are seeing manifest online is in fact also happening on other modes of media, but much more visibly with respect to our day-to-day interactions. One final thing I'd like to mention here is informational privacy. When surveillance happens, quite often people also self-censor. And this happens quite often in societies where there are weak rule of law frameworks, which I mean by saying that a rule of law being essentially that there's a certainty that whether you are under surveillance, there are certain conditions and safeguards why it's happening. But when there's mass gathering of information and you can be targeted for it, people are very scared voicing their opinions online.
On that point, you mentioned misinformation. I think it leads to hate speech. And something that I would like to ask you is particularly with regards to the recent upload by the WSJ report on Facebook India's lax treatment of hate speech. What is your position? And of course, your position will be based out of facts and figures that you must have analyzed over a period of time, is on the treatment of hate speech on social media. Should we leave it to the platforms to regulate it themselves, or there is a case for greater government scrutiny? And now the government is also notified that there will be government regulations with regards to the OTT platforms. So
with respect to the Wall Street Journal story, just to give a background, there have been it comes from some history, and the history is essentially number one. Facebook has close to 200 million active users in India. There's the largest base of users, in fact, all over the world in India for Facebook. Number two, Facebook essentially states that all of its content side decisions are taken by Facebook Inc., which is situated at one hacker way, all the way in the United States in Silicon Valley, not in India. And its India staff does not ordinarily exercise control over it. What the Wall Street Journal story actually showed was India's public policy chief, whose core job essentially is to liaise with government to ensure that the business interests of Facebook are not unduly impacted by regulation, are also inputting into a specific takedown, which is contemplated for hate speech by a BJP politician. And the public policy chief reasons that this takedown would in fact impact Facebook's quote unquote business prospects in India. The second thing which is important to consider is that Facebook does not only have a very large audience, Facebook also makes a lot of advertising money. Its essential model, which is sometimes derisively described as surveillance capitalism, essentially is to keep people on Facebook and gather as much information as it can, which are then sold to third-party advertisers, not the information, but at least information points through which contextual advertisements based on the interests and the profile, as well as the essential demographics of that person can be served. For instance, for me, it would be something around reading, writing courses or works of art. For somebody else, it could be shoes. But for all of us who are in a democracy, it is also politics, right? So one of the biggest advertisers for Facebook, as well as any large Silicon Valley platform, which is an ad-driven model, are actually political parties. And this is what has been also a realization which has come through Cambridge Analytica. Now, the issue which emerges here, what is the form of regulation we should contemplate? Because we need to also understand any regulation places greater power in the hands of the government. And the government, in any sense in India, has a very low division historically between the political objectives of that government and the governance objectives of that government, where both merge, right? And what I mean by that is that governance objectives will be much more constitutionally centered, and the political objectives will be much more centered towards the perpetuation and the expansion of its power in terms of a much more cemented mandate. Now, if you're devising regulation for the sake of regulation because Silicon Valley platforms are not behaving properly, then you're essentially creating a new problem in order to solve an older one. Hence, any interventions which take place here need to be based on evidence, need to be limited, and need to actually address the harm after we identify. For instance, with here, a clear harm which emerges, for instance, in cases of disinformation around elections, can be addressed by the Election Commission of India, which has not done it to appropriate level. And what we also see is that there's so much hate speech on social media these days. Now, again, there is a systemic problem there, and I think we need to sit down because it again would impact how people express their otherwise legitimate opinions online, which may not be hate speech, and hate speech is contextual. That is why these are complex problems, and more people need to engage with them.
It seems like the enforcement of such quote unquote censorship tends to be very arbitrary in India, where we're not cracking down enough on the harmful kinds of speech as we need to. But at the same time, we're using the justification, various justifications to crack down on speech which may not be as harmful. Do you sense that arbitrariness in our public policy as it relates to social media regulations?
So, there's a very lively debate which has been taking place in the United States for a long period of time with respect to its hate speech laws, where there are some statutes and there are limitations on speech in the United States. People think the First Amendment there, in fact, removes a lot of it. It does not, in fact. Okay, you just need to study the prosecutions for, let's say, obscenity there, or for around the National Security Act. Now, the thing is that, but on hate speech, the position has been that if the structures of enforcement itself are not progressive and manned by people who believe in the Constitution, which has a diversity, then the substantive provisions, even if they are for hate speech with respect to protecting minorities, will in fact be used to target those very same minorities. So, for instance, we have this patriarchal indecent representation of Women's Act. And I call it patriarchal because it is not based in agency, it is based in a parda-based system, right? It's actually been used against women activists who have actually advocated for menstrual health. If you have a hate speech law without having the kind of police reforms which are needed in India, for the enforcement of protection of minorities or the segments of population studied through evidence, or gender-based minorities or women, or much more generally, which is evidenced just through anecdotal inferences. They are attacked much more often. There are threats made against them as to a body, as well as sexual violence, just when they voice even the slightest bit of political opinions. Unless we have this kind of recognition in the enforcement and insulation from political interference, a better rule of law system, we will not have the enforcement, even if we have the best laws. And I think here, there's necessity to pause, because I think your audience happens to be 28.4. Okay, so let me just say this. Okay, if you look at the United States and you study its history, right, it has almost had a secession take place after 100 years of independence, right? And India is a fairly young nation. We have to think about the longer course of history. And in the longer course of history, if we work with a positive conception of what is possible with respect to the constitutional values which have been set by the founding mothers and fathers of this country, then we will be able to actually realize them through technology. Because technology is a catalyzing force. It is changing so much in our society. There are fundamental rights which have not been fulfilled for a long period of time, which remain imperfect, and even in future will be only achieved to a very imperfect level in terms of the aspirations that we have will still become better. So in fact, the merger of technology and fundamental rights is very essential to this.
So I want to sort of talk about this a little bit more, because I would have agreed with your views maybe a decade ago, but evidence of the recent past has shown me that technology is not quite the unequivocal force for good that I thought it would be when I was sort of growing up and when Facebook and social media first came onto the scene. Now, I think there's a growing recognition, with the recently released documentary on Netflix, Social Dilemma, that these products are designed in a way to make them addictive. They're designed in a way to fuel constant hostility and outrage in our society. They're designed in a way to sort of promote these, quote unquote, fake news stories in a way to make them viral, just so that they can, make money off of our attention and capture our attention in order to fuel their bottom lines. So in my view, it seems like the case for greater intervention is becoming stronger. At the same time, I share your views on civil liberties and not encroaching on them. But do you feel like your views on some of these technology platforms has sort of moderated towards the other direction in the recent past?
So it's great, Abhishek, you point me in a direction which brings in two conceptions. The conception is firstly of a utopia and the second is a dystopia, right? And quite often people think about technology in terms of it being a dystopia, but just imagine this conversation we're having right now. What's facilitating it?
Right.
What's the core value around it, right? And we have this perpetual flux also, in which certain behaviors are being built in us, which is the pressure to share our private innate moments in life on things such as Instagram with the infinite scroll, with teams of engineers, in fact, hundreds of people working in Amazon to make sure that our mental models can be fooled by Alexa into thinking that we are having a conversation with a person. And that kind of thing does worry me. Technology is not neutral. And I do believe that there is a case for greater regulatory scrutiny and intervention. However, I always advocate for limiting that and intervening in spaces where we have evidence and where there is a precautionary level of intervention when there is great harm. For instance, in any kind of determinations by technology platforms, which leads to a legal impact. For in fact, facial recognition, which is a mass surveillance technology, right? And can lead, especially in India, because of the weak rule of law system, excessive legal powers, as well as a culture in law enforcement to not go by those legal powers and safeguards in terms of what happens in our interactions with the police, which are less than healthy, right? Especially towards minorities. When this technology matches the institutional culture in terms of that kind of policing, the results are disastrous. What do we advocate? We advocate for a ban, in fact, okay? And that's the global consensus. However, when you look at the larger movement of technology, we need to be concerned with other things rather than just data. We need to be looking at how data, just like how monetary frameworks over a period of time have resulted in a level of inequality in society, technology can also lead to that level of inequality in society. And I believe that is the core problem here, where a small set of people who are what is now called centobillionaires, I think so, and people who are working in these large Silicon Valley companies are essentially having visions towards making social platforms, getting into all aspects of society, governance, individual and private interactions without processes which are democratic, which are open, which lack the necessary basis of scrutiny and pushback. which is why it's important to again go back to constitutionalism. I do share your skepticism. I do share the need for regulatory intervention. However, the case that I make is a much more it's a much more nuanced one, and I have no love for the platforms. In fact, I'm not on Facebook.
That's great. I think if you want to be a successful lawyer, get off Facebook. That is one of the learnings from today. You mentioned the desire to ban, and this word has been thrown around a lot, both in public discourse and in public policy over the past couple of months, as it relates to various apps that were uh, that were pretty popular in India, including TikTok and 58 others which I can't remember off the top of my head. But they were banned on national security grounds. The way I view it, and this isn't the case that the government has made necessarily, but if you think about two versions of the internet, you have like the Chinese version of the internet where there's the heavy involvement of the state, the interlinking of enterprise and the state in China, which means there are legitimate concerns about data privacy, and there is a legitimate grounds for intervention when you have millions of users under the age of 18 using platforms such as TikTok, which is obviously a product of ByteDance, a Chinese company. Um, so just starting there, what are your views on the bans as they relate to these specific Chinese apps? Do you buy that national security concern on data privacy, and is the ban the appropriate public policy in this instance?
So I just came off another online conversation where I gave a very extensive lecture to law students primarily around the legality of the bans, the power which is used. And the takeaway I wanted them to have essentially was that the bans emerge on the basis of popular discourse rather than legality. And that should worry us. Populism by itself, when it leads to certain actions, for instance, one noticed immediately after the bans television channels saying things such as, quote unquote, the sheer suddenness of the move. And there was also it was phrased as a digital strike or something like that. So, what does it do tangibly in terms of credible policy making, evidence-based policy making? Also, the legal controls which are followed is very poor. It comes off as almost as China envy. Firstly, what's important to recognize is that the large tech platforms actually have a huge integration with the CCP, which is the ruling party of the Chinese state. That is undeniable. Correct. There is a national security risk there. This is very well illustrated by John Lancaster in an essay called Document Number 9 in the London Review of Books. Document number 9 is an internal communique of the CCP, essentially, which lays out a strategy how the internet poses a fundamental challenge to the Chinese way of society, how democracy, civil society, etc., are gaining a foothold and need to be countered. These are the hallmarks of our country, in fact. And the Chinese state in 2010 says to counter that, we need to ensure that the internet is more controlled, much more beyond the firewall, the great firewall of China, which more people know about, towards inward control itself, where it does two things principally. Number one, it builds a vast surveillance network. And secondly, it starts what is called as an unofficial program in which it pays a large number of people, which are called the 50-cent army, because they're paid 50 cents for every post that they make promoting the Chinese state across the social media networks which are available there. The goal is not total censorship of each political opinion, but to reduce two things. Number one, online agitation and organization by itself, which takes place, which directs criticism, which is effective of the state. And the second is essentially any kind of online influencers who may be able to, at a very high level, activate a level of criticism which is effective. So they're not going after individuals on a case-to-case basis. They're looking at it on a much more aggregate basis. This is a pervasive system of inward-based censorship. Firstly, block off access from the outside. Secondly, internalize that level of state control over platforms itself. What do we see happening in India with respect to the bans? Firstly, the ban is taking place through a power to block websites. There are press releases which do not mention the word China. They do not mention any objective finding or reasoning. They in an appendix list 59 applications whose functionality is very different. They range from TikTok towards Cam Scanner, and they may have different owners, different funders, different algorithms and different risks, but none of that is reasoned, right? So the level of public confidence and trust in decision making goes down. This order itself is not published and is not made available. So it's a secret, opaque process. And this conflicts again with the norms of democracy. And finally, what I would like to say is that there's a large amount of market opportunity which emerges right after bans, in which a lot of local Indian startups say that, hey, it's given us a fill up and we can now finally compete, right? In the segments that these applications were emerging. Now, this is again coming off as China envy. So I would question ourselves, right? Are we really thinking in terms of a level of insecurity, which is making us voice things much more often or think towards us that whether we have too much democracy? Is that a bad thing? I think in the course of any economic development, technical development, which is necessary in India, given that we are a multicultural society composed of various cultures, one of the greatest strengths for us, in fact, is our basis of democracy, our rule of law. And even if that pace of development is slower, it's negotiated, there is a system of compromise present with it. The technical systems which build around it will be much more stable. Finally, if there are issues with these applications, we need institutional frameworks. You know why? Because you can ban 300 to 500 applications, but there's so many. If there is a credible risk to national security, we need an institutional body to look at it on a continuing basis. If there are threats to individual privacy, we do need a data protection law, which is based and premised on user rights, on protecting each one of us. And does India have these things? Arguably, it may have an institution for cybersecurity, but is it acting in this manner? One only needs to look at the NSO Pegasus incident, where WhatsApp sent a notification to CERT-in, which is the body to look at computer risks in India, and CERT-in not even responding to it. So there was a documented case of how malware was used against at least about 200 to 300 activists in India through hacking into their phones, which was notified to authority, which is tasked with the function of keeping people's digital interactions safe.
Certainly, and I think spyware was mostly used in the Delhi case when the riots happened, if I'm not mistaken, to hack into the mobile phones of the people who were at the forefront of the active. But moving on to something that's of interest to our viewers is Kashmir. And Kashmir has been in distress for over a year, and with no internet connection, and with barely 2 weeks of schooling a year for children. Now, when we talk about equality and we talk about this COVID times equality that is through internet access, I usually learn from my computer. But when we talk about the people in Kashmir and mostly the children, they do not have any equality in terms of access to the internet. What are the tools that are being used by the government in terms, is the government doing anything with regards to bringing access for internet to these people? Because I understand that internet connection, when we talk about Zoom or the Teams app, you cannot use those apps on 2G internet. You only require 3G or 4G internet. So what is going on? How is the government dealing with this?
So firstly, the ongoing restriction is on 4G access. People may say that wireline access through fiber or through telephone is available to people, but that only comes with a high amount of economic privilege. And if you look at the TRAI and DOT figures by itself, large category of people who are internet users are on smartphone devices. That's the first thing, because it's convenient, it's easy, it's cheaper, and you can get online very easily. There is an economic barrier there, but it's lesser compared to wireline. Wireline is a small fraction of that. Second is that we are close to 500 days in Jammu as well as in Kashmir with respect to the restriction on 4G internet access. The third thing is there have been close to 3 petitions which have been filed. The Internet Freedom Foundation has been involved in all 3 of them. The first one was with respect to the telecommunication shutdown. The Supreme Court laid down certain guidelines. The government failed to follow them. Secondly, we went back to court. Here, the government did say that it will try to, and the court made another body to supervise and head what were the initial orders made, and that was seeming to be some kind of reform which took place. The third round of litigation was where we got some incremental restoration in 2 of the 20 districts. So there are about 20 districts in Jammu and Kashmir. Only 2 have got restoration of 4G, and the government essentially gave an undertaking to the court that it would, on the basis of evidence, incrementally restore 4G internet all through. That's not happened. And there's a huge amount of distress, especially for young school-going children. I think it's setting them back tremendously. They have not only lost a year, they have lost opportunities. Young people who work in the IT sector there, the handicrafts industry, the dry fruits industry, the tourism industry, there have been very severely impacted. And I would say that at this point in time, we will make our best efforts to avail all kind of judicial remedies, talk to the people there. But it's very disappointing. I would not like to end on this note, though. I would like to end on a note which is a bit more realistic, if not positive. On our part, we are committed towards viewing constitutional rights for everyone, from Jammu and Kashmir to the people in Andaman and Nicobar, for whom we have also represented to the Prime Minister's office, and a fiber optic cable has been promised towards giving them 4G connectivity, which they lack right now. There are 28,000 villages in India which do not have internet connectivity. And I would pose this as a challenge to the people who are listening to this podcast, that when we do listen to this podcast, to feel a sense of empathy for the people who do not have internet access, because today it is not a luxury. And this goes beyond Jammu and Kashmir. I believe that when we think about issues in a much more national framework, which includes people in Jammu and Kashmir and includes people in those 28,000 villages, includes people in Andaman and Nicobar, we will be able to win. When people who do not have access to the internet and people from whom access is deprived, when we think about those school-going children. Because here's the thing, you may be able to even prescribe through the state board examination a less, a course load which is less, or which is designed in a way in COVID times to not ensure that students who don't have these facilities of attending classes remotely are not unduly impacted. But what happens on national level competitive examinations? What happens to their job opportunities? And what happens to their future? After all, we are a young country, and we need to think about the technologies which actually help people think about us in a much more positive conception, and for us to also engage with them and to show them that there's a greater sense of empathy and humanity present in all of us.
I can't
Definitely.
think.
And yes, I can't think of a better to end this. If anybody's interested, if our viewers are interested in knowing more about the uh, advocacy campaign that IFF has led in Andaman, Nicobar, and Kashmir, I would direct them to IFF's website that has complete detailed reports on how they went about it. So our viewers, we will link them down in a description box. So please have a look. Abhishek, over to you now.
Abhishek, Sanskriti, just one word before you end it. In fact, we have a forum. So all of our staffers are there, and people send us uh, comments, criticisms. There are technologists there, people who work in several exciting Bangalore-based startups. So it's forum.internetfreedom.in, and I encourage viewers of this podcast to in fact, open a conversation with us there, and also get surprised if they get a response from me or from the other staffers there. We would love to hear from you, and I encourage you to go there. Why there and why not on social media? The reason is that our experience with social media is, number one, we are under surveillance. Okay, that doesn't happen on our forum. The second is that it's a place for much more calmer reflection, sustained conversation. It's not boring. You can even post a meme there. I post it sometimes, but the thing is that you can actually have a much more sustained conversation with people, come back with ideas. It's the way you would talk with a friend. So I do encourage people to come to the forum and not only talk with us, but the larger community of about 700 people who are there.
Exactly, and before this started, before you logged in, Abhishek asked me, "Is this only for lawyers?" And I was like, "No, this is just like us." They get responses from people who are designers,
Yeah,
people who
designers,
work in tech,
artists.
and yeah, website designer, web designers. I think you called for some of them in the recent past, and it's for everyone. And this is is something new, because you don't just deal with the legality of the
Not at
case.
all. Not at all.
Exactly.
We made a video also to Simon and Garfunkel's Sound of Silence, explaining the deprivation in Jammu and Kashmir. We work with illustrators, designers. We make video explainers why the two-factor authentication is good and how you can switch it on. We had a webinar on the privacy of your WhatsApp texts when a lot of this kind of WhatsApp texts were being shown on television channels, and the name of that webinar is "Why is Nabika reading my text?" So we engage with humor, the full range of human emotion, because that's us, right? That's what technology is today.
Well, on that note, Apar, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, so much to follow up on, and we really hope that we'll have you back at some point to talk about all the other issues that we need to get to in the regulation of technology and platforms.
Thank you so much, and for this opportunity. Take care.